we're very excited to be joined by Dr. Adam Elliot Cooper and Dr. Rana Barakat. Thank you both so much for joining us. Dr. Adam Elliot Cooper is joining us from London, and he is a research associate in sociology at the University of Greenwich, where his current research focuses on anti-racism and British policing, both on the British mainland and in Britain's colonies. He also sits on the board of the Monitoring Group, a community organization challenging racism and state violence and racial violence. Adam's book, Black Resistance to British Policing, will be published in spring 2021. Dr. Rana Barakat is joining us from Ramallah. She is an assistant professor of history and contemporary Arab studies at Birzeit University in Palestine. Her research interests include the history and historiography of colonialism, nationalism, and cultures of resistance. She is currently completing a book monograph titled The Barak Revolt, Constructing a History of Resistance in Palestine, and is already working on a second book monograph titled Lifta and Resisting the Museumification of Palestine, Indigenous History of the Nakba. And I'm Sarona Bedouan, McCann's Outreach Officer. I'll be facilitating today's talk. Behind the scenes as well, we have my colleagues Hussein Khalidi and Pascal Payan. You won't be able to see them, but they will be the ones writing to you in the chat bar, making sure everything runs smoothly. So thank you so much both for your support. So before we start the conversations with our speakers, I'd like to go ahead and give you all a brief background on today's topic. From the 1800s to the fall of the British Empire after the Second World War, Britain exploited and policed around a quarter of the territory of the globe, including Mandate Palestine. In this environment, the British state developed complex and repressive forms of control, which relied on racist attitudes and prejudices against the colonized peoples. Although these militarized practices of oppression were originally reserved for those targeted by Britain's empire, they were soon incorporated into British ideas of domestic policing and, in the Palestinian case, into the fabric of Israeli colonization and suppression of Palestinians. In both contexts, the related ideas of criminality upon which these systems have been built have led to the racialization of certain populations to be seen inherently as a threat, justifying mass incarceration, deportations, and large-scale surveillance, amongst other oppressive practices. In the UK, this legacy can be seen in the policing of Black British and other people from Britain's former colonies and urban centers to the targeting of Muslim communities and the criminalization of migrants at our borders. For Palestinians, since the beginning of the Israeli occupation in 1967, around 1/5 of the population has at one time or another been imprisoned by Israel. And according to Adamir, a Palestinian NGO working on the rights of prisoners, as of April 2020, around 5,000 prisoners are in Israeli jails, including 432 of those held without charge or trial. With the continued murders of Black people at the hands of the police worldwide and subsequent mass demonstrations, these past few months have led many to reassess their views on justice, racism, criminality, police, and prisons. Black Lives Matter UK have been leading protests and demonstrations against police racism and violence in the UK, calling to dismantle imperialism, capitalism, white supremacy, patriarchy, and the state structures that disproportionately and systematically harm Black people in Britain and around the world. Drawing on the tradition of historical internationalist Black Palestinian solidarity, the global element of the struggle and connections to Palestine were made explicit this summer when BLM UK tweeted in support of Palestinian rights in the face of looming Israeli annexation. This is particularly relevant when we look at how British domestic and foreign policy continues to support Israeli state oppression of Palestinians by exchanges in technology and weapons. Throughout today's talk, we hope to further explore the legacy of UK colonialism for both Black and other minority communities here and for Palestinians living under the Israeli rule, in order to look more closely at the deep problematic roots of the criminal justice system and its link to war and militarism. So, with this background covered, I'd like to go ahead and start the conversation with Rana and Adam. So, Adam, if you can please tell us a little bit about the origins of policing in the UK and its roots in the British military and policing of British colonies.
Thanks so much. So I guess British policing formally begins in the 19th century. It's founded by a man called Robert Peel, but British policing, in a less formalised sense, has a much older history. And most of British policing actually hasn't taken place on the British mainland. There's been mentioned much of British policing has taken place in its colonies. And so while the formal police service began on the British mainland in the early 19th century, for significant periods of time before that, Britain was doing different types of policing. So there was a kind of a militarised form of policing on the British mainland, which repressed workers' movements, peasants' revolts, and other uprisings from the working classes, peasant people. But I think often not remembered, and I think equally as significantly, was the kind of British policing which took place in its colonies, whether it be its slave colonies in parts of the Caribbean and North America before American independence, or whether it be its indirect colonies across parts of the African continent, or what became to be known as the Middle East, or the Indian subcontinent, or its other settler non-slave colonies in Australia and New Zealand. We see the necessity of British power to control very, very large populations, becoming a very important component of maintaining its imperial possessions. So I think one of the most important and interesting ways in which we see policing really being developed and looking more similar to the policing we recognise today is in the periods of decolonisation in the early to mid 20th century. And I think there's probably two figures who are quite interesting that help us to illustrate how it is that colonial policing paved the way for the kinds of racialised policing that we see in Britain today. The first is a man called Frank Kitson. Frank Kitson was engaged in what we call counter-insurgency policing. So counter-insurgency policing was a form of policing in which there was no discernible or no attempts to create a discernible separation between the police and the military. And I think this is really important because I don't think we should think about the police and the military as being two separate entities. We should instead think about them as being a continuum. And although here on the British mainland there is at least an attempt to create the impression that there's a very clear link, a clear differentiation between the police and the military. In the colonies, there was no such differentiation, and the police and the military worked as one singular unit. And there are probably broadly speaking, three major tactics which was employed by the counterinsurgency police. I would say the first is the idea of suspect communities. So whether it be in Kenya, where the Kikuyu ethnic group were identified as a suspect community, and General Frank Kitson was one of the officers in charge of identifying Kikuyu dissidents, which they called the Mau Mau, engaged in resistance to British colonial power, where they were rounded up, put into internment camps, which many framed as concentration camps. Hundreds of thousands were put there for long periods of time without proper trial or representation. Thousands were killed, and many of them tortured as well. Or whether it be the Chinese Malay in British Malaya, who were engaged in an anti-colonial uprising, where large numbers of people of Chinese heritage living in Malaya at this time were rounded up into what were effectively internment camps and held there by the British as well. So you can see from these different kind of colonial contexts, we have the same person working in both of these contexts. And Frank Kitson ended his colonial career in Ireland, where he was working on the so-called Troubles, where the people of Ireland were resisting British rule and attempting to gain independence, and again employed similar kinds of tactics of collective punishment. The other forms of policing we saw, in addition to collective punishments, were mass surveillance, which we might be familiar with today in terms of the technology that we use, but I guess more kind of rudimentary forms of surveillance were being used, partly by putting large people into a confined area, but also other things such as checkpoints and curfews and other forms of surveillance as well. And through those kinds of forms of mass punishment and surveillance and control of these populations, and using kind of racial discourse and racial ideas, whether it be the Kikuyu or the Chinese Malaya or the Catholic Republicans, we see this kind of racist policing being fundamental to the ways in which Britain attempted to hold on to its colonies in the periods of decolonisation. Lastly, I think I want to mention Kenneth Newman, who was another really important colonial police officer. Kenneth Newman began his career as a colonial police officer in British Palestine, and from that experience of policing in Palestine, he then moved to Northern Ireland, where he was able to use that experience of policing a colonized population to better control and repress the resistance being engaged in by against the British in the 1960s and 70s in Northern Ireland. And I might return to him a little bit later, because he eventually became head of the Metropolitan Police and made huge changes to the way in which policing of multicultural urban areas in Britain were policed in the 1970s and 80s as well. But I'll leave it there for now.
Thanks. And I think it's incredibly important to kind of understand the roots of where this emerged and the ways in which, in the spaces in which it manifests. So I think that leads a really good interlude actually to you, Rana. Could you please tell us about what British policing looks like in Palestine during the British Mandate era? What were some of the methods used by the British, and to what extent were these influenced by British experiences in repression in other parts of the empire?
Okay, thank you. I would like to just begin by saying thank you to all of you who put this together and for making these kinds of connections out loud. While preparing for this event, I thought about some of the threads that connect the past to the present, and about how we make these kinds of connections to imagine and go about creating a future for ourselves. That, I humbly think, is the work of the historian, if that's what I might claim today. History matters, and it does not end. We are all here. All the powers of oppression that we will discuss today are historically grounded, have been employed against our very beings and bodies, and many, far too many, have been lost, murdered by these powers over the long centuries, and we were not meant to survive, as the great poet Audre Lorde explained, but we are here. So first, I'd like to say that colonialism did not end. Do not believe the lies that tell us otherwise. The systems of economic, political, and military power that fueled Columbus's genocidal missions, that fueled the once largest navy in the world of the British Empire, still continue to fuel systems of oppression. What we know of empire, and particularly the British empires, was just explained by Adam, is that nothing is contained. In the sense of economy, which we know very well, as we stand precariously on the ground of a world devastated by a pandemic and governments that could not and will not protect people over profit. And in the sense of, as we will discuss today, military and its close partner, policing. Specifically in Palestine, as a quick historical review, I'm sure many of the audience know, Palestine, as the case in other geographies, and in particularly here in the Eastern Mediterranean, was a battleground in the First World War, often called the Imperial War for obvious reasons. In 1917, in London, Arthur Balfour made his ominous declaration supporting the Zionist movement and Zionist settler colonial ambitions in Palestine. And then a short 2 years later, in 1919, General Allenby declared his army's victory in Palestine, and Palestine fell under the category of occupied enemy territory east and was militarily occupied. Police and policing in Palestine was born from and of this military occupation and was actually never divorced from it. So the empire and imperial connections in terms of military occupation and policing was always a tool of this military occupation. And there are three things that I think I'd like to highlight that make imperial connections between both the past and the present and geographies. There were clear connections between Palestine and other parts of the British Empire. For example, from India, where we see Bramley, who is the Department Inspector General of Police of what they call the United Provinces of India. He was brought into what they called, again, occupied enemy territory in 1919 to oversee the making of the police force. And there's an obvious connection there between India and Palestine. And the connections, the second point is the connection with the military and the police, as Adam just explained. In the case of Palestine, as was a connection between military police from Ireland into Palestine, the Black and Tans, and how the British policed their various geographies was how they militarily occupied them in the empire. And we see not only similarity in terms of techniques and tactics, but also in cases like the connections between Ireland and Palestine, they were policed by the same people. And the third point is actually an interesting point that is also a lot of people think is exceptional in Palestine, but it's not. It was a training of local police forces, as was the case in West African colonies. This is where locally we see the coming about of the Palestine police force. It was led by a large number of British forces, and it was always led by the British, but there were also local training, and there was contingents that were Jewish, made up of settlers, and there were local Palestinian Arabs. So in that context, we're also occupying ourselves and policing ourselves. And here I'd like to talk about what was described as, and I've described in the past as, the criminalization of resistance. My own work on the Mandate period this is born out of my own work in the Mandate period and what I'm interested in. In the Mandate period, the police forces were not only militarily motivated in strategy in terms of surveilling and controlling the local population, but it was informed by what was just described as counter-insurgency. That was the main motivation for both the police and the military. And in times of resistance and revolt in Palestine, which was ongoing throughout the Mandate period and afterwards, the police gave way to the military forces in ways that you can't necessarily distinguish between them. We see this happening in 1929, and certainly it happened between 1936 and 1939. The police's mandate was far less abrasive than the military, but the kind of sort of the way that transition happened almost immediately was that the police was almost there as a frontier force in order for the military to be able to not always be occupying. But as soon as anything happened, it wasn't only military tactics that the police were using, but it was also a military occupation that was continuous, that never ended. What we see over the long history of resistance in Palestine is that police and policing were part and parcel of this military plan. So when we hear about the militarization of the police, this is neither unique nor is it exceptional. All you need to do is look back into the Mandate period in Palestine and the brutal present of how the Israeli forces, which what we'll talk about in a little bit, the brutal present is a long legacy of the basis of the militarization of police. The police were basically the military.
Thank you so much for that. And I think it's incredibly important, as you say, especially in your own work, to look at the criminalization of resistance historically. And I think now I would actually like to move forward to look at the present day and how these practices and ideas of criminality evolved into the present day justice systems and prison industrial complexes in both contexts. And Rana, I'd like for you to actually speak on the Palestinian context. And I guess if you can speak a bit more about to what extent have these British practices been adopted by Israel in their treatment of Palestinians and other racialized minorities, especially under differing Israeli militarized authorities. If Adam, you can start us off, please.
So I'll talk a little bit about the ways in which these forms of colonial policing have come to inform and shape racist policing in modern Britain. So we begin to see the kinds of colonial tactics that we might be familiar with in Britain's colonies, such as Palestine or Kenya or Malaya or the north of Ireland or other places such as Cyprus or Sri Lanka and elsewhere, begin to creep in quite probably most poignantly in the 1980s in Britain. When we begin to see the use of, I guess we can divide them into kind of two areas. On the one hand, we have the kind of discourses or racial ideas or kinds of racist thinking or rhetoric. And the other, we see the kind of very material, practical police policies being employed, right? So let's begin with the ideas. So the idea that what we'll call the coloured migrants, people coming from Britain's former colonies in Africa and Asia and the Caribbean and elsewhere, were bringing with them a different set of moral values, a different kind of criminality to Britain. And Kenneth Newman very famously remarks when he was head of the Metropolitan Police that the new immigrant groups weren't inculcated with the same law-abiding and respectable values of the British people, and therefore a different kind of policing was necessary. And so you see in the 1970s and 80s as significant numbers of people from Britain's colonies begin to arrive on the British mainland, that we that racist ideas from Britain's colonies migrate to Britain in significant ways as well. So whether it be stereotypes around black people being drifters or drug dealers or muggers or Rastafarians or black extremists or pimps, or all of these different types of stereotypes begin to arise. And it really comes to a head in the 1980s with the idea that black people are muggers. So we begin to see the word mugging being used in Britain in the mid-1970s, a term kind of borrowed from the United States. And this is used to... What's interesting, I think, is that mugging isn't a crime in itself. Mugging is a category of crime. So what it does is it kind of vacuums up lots of already existing crimes, theft, robbery, assault, etc., and into this new category of crime, creating the impression that these types of problems are new in themselves. And therefore, by creating the impression these problems are new, they can say that they have arrived in Britain from new people. And who are these new people? These are black people who have migrated to Britain, or the children of these migrants who have been born in Britain in the 1970s or 80s. And so through this kind of racial thinking, this kind of racist rhetoric from the press and from politicians, we begin to see a very kind of directly racist form of policing being directed at black communities, generally through the sus law, so laws of suspicion, enabling the police to stop, search, arrest, apprehend young black people in particular on suspicion of engaging in so-called mugging. But what we then see, I think is important, is a form of resistance to this kind of policing. We see urban uprisings in St Paul's, in Bristol, in the south of England, and in Nottingham, in Radford, in the East Midlands of England in 1980. And then we see further uprisings in 1981 in Liverpool, in Manchester, in London, in Leeds, a number of different cities across the country. And it's at this moment that we begin to see forms of colonial and counter-insurgency police tactics being employed by Sir Kenneth Newman, based on his experience both in Palestine, but I think very importantly in Northern Ireland as well, where he was responsible for the transition from military policing, so British Army occupation, to the Irish Constabulary, a domestic police force being used in the north of Ireland at this time. That's the 1970s. So by the late 1970s, early 1980s, he's taking those counterinsurgency tactics and he's employing them on the British mainland. So these tactics include, for the first time on the British mainland, the use of CS spray or tear gas being used first in Toxteth in Liverpool and then in Manchester's Moss Side. We see for the first time the use of rubber bullets, or what we might call baton rounds, being brought to a protest site. This is in 1985 at Tottenham during the uprisings of that year. We begin to also see the tactics of mass surveillance and mass arrest. So the mass arrest of entire communities, not necessarily protesters, but anyone on the streets being arrested during the periods of these uprisings. But also we see another tactic which was used in Northern Ireland and other colonial contexts, which is the attempt to disperse large crowds by driving vehicles into large crowds. So this was first employed on the British mainland intentionally in Toxteth in Liverpool, and it led to a disabled man being killed by the police due to that tactic being used. So here in the 1980s, you see the way in which racism leads to a form of surveillance and group punishment imposed upon black communities, resistance emerging in the early 1980s, and then counterinsurgency tactics being very explicitly used in the 1980s. And there were two kind of colonial police forces which were brought in to England in the 1980s to help to consult on these kind of counterinsurgency tactics. The first was the Irish Constabulary in Northern Ireland, and the second was the Hong Kong police. And I think this is important because these were effectively Britain's two significant remaining colonies at this time, Hong Kong and the north of Ireland. And so you see this kind of colonial policing being employed in the 1980s in really quite explicit ways. And And I think this was kind of the genesis in many ways of this kind of counterinsurgency policing being a very explicit technique to be used on the British mainland against racialised communities. And it's in the decades following, you see counterinsurgency tactics being ramped up in a number of different contexts. And maybe I'll talk about them a bit later, but I think, of course, post 9/11 7/7, you really see them being used against Muslim populations, counterinsurgency policing, and also in the so-called war on gangs following the civil unrest of 2011.
Thank you, Adam. And Rana, would you like to pick up? Oh, I think you're unmuted. Let's go ahead and unmute you. There you go. If you can begin again. Thank you.
I thought I muted myself. That's one of my nightmares. I think the use of counterinsurgency is so interesting because it's so prevalent in colonial studies. I mean, anybody that thinks about the British in Palestine, counterinsurgency was the title basically of what the police and the military were doing from the very beginning. So I want to make the connections with Israeli practices in the same way that Adam just did in Britain. So obviously there's a connection between what is now being used and what's been used for the last 70 years. And these tactics were introduced and used by the British. For one, you find the laws and legal systems. The British, in the pursuit of control, put down resistance by all means available to it. Those violent means of control that continue again into our present is in the form of collective punishment, house demolitions, mass arrests. For example, you have the Kafkaesque category of administrative detention, which you alluded to earlier. It's a tool that was first introduced by the British in pursuit of who they considered to be suspicious. It's often used as a means of arresting someone for no reason, but for suspicion of potentially being somebody who resists that kind of oppression, colonial oppression. Here, what we see is not only the draconian sense of guilt until proven innocence, it's actually guilt without any means of proving otherwise. That is a hard, fast legacy of colonial logic in Palestine, from the British to the Israelis. But I want to be careful here because I want to not exceptionalize Palestine, but I do want to make sure that we understand the settler colonial context in Palestine. There's a lot of academic work that I'm sure everybody in this audience is aware of that focuses on settler colonialism and the use of the analytic. And I don't want to or need to review that here, but I want to focus on how you refer to racialized minorities. It's a somewhat imported term that doesn't always track in the same way under Zionist settler colonialism, and I kind of want to be careful about that. Minority is not indigenous, and here, native Palestinians are not minorities that have in one way or another been incorporated into the state. Even within the Green Line, 48er Palestinians who are actually citizens, albeit of a different class, are people who are denied access to their peoplehood. Under military occupation in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, this denial is material under military occupation again. And in the large and vast Shatat, this denial is at its full and most devastating exposure. No doubt Zionism is hegemonic and supremacist in a brand of whiteness, and it's comparable to other geographies for sure, with the kind of specifics that Adam was just talking about, but it's really important not to reproduce settler categories within the context of Palestine. So of course, within the state, amongst those who are citizens of the state, albeit second, third, or fourth class citizens, there is a distinct racialization and racism. Ashkenazi citizens who are white citizens of the state have always been, within the ideology of Zionism, the only desirable citizen. But settlers, again, work to eliminate the natives. So that needs to be understood, and the complexities attended to in terms of how we read this situation. In the context of Zionism, again, Palestinians actually have no place. Forms of violence used against Palestinians are to eliminate our presence on the land and our presence in the history, as many of you know. This kind of settler colonial violence manifests itself in a multitude of ways that have changed over time. But we need to remember that forms of violence are not only about control here, but about elimination. Having said that, the settler state is certainly a militarized state, which means all tools of the state in terms of surveillance and control are at the core of its military tactics and control. We can see state violence very clearly throughout historic Palestine. We can see it used against what are considered racial minorities within the state. We saw that last year with an uprising that happened in Tel Aviv. We're seeing this daily in the kind of protests that are against the current government. But we also need to attend to the particularities of what settler colonialism means. And you can also look at a geography like Jerusalem, which has its particularities with regard to how it's occupied. And you can see that how the settlers employed different forms of power in the form of border police, army, and different kinds of police that are performing tactics of control under the kind of militarization that has been known to be something more recent, but is actually a historical phenomenon. Iyad al-Hallaq, who was murdered by the state, was actually murdered by what is called the police in Jerusalem. So just to summarize right now, the legacy of, to bring this back to Britain, the colonial mandate, the legacy of the mandate are twofold. As a mandate, it was a system that was set up, and as an imperial power, the state gave space and enabled the settler system to form and grow. The subsequent settler state is not a historical surprise if we understand what the British were doing here. The legacies of violence and power are vast, which is why so many of us are interested in the mandate period to begin with. One aspect of this that I think we can think about together is the concept that you introduced as the prison industrial system complex. It's obviously something that that Adam can discuss with eloquence with regards to Britain and the colonies, but it's something that, and it's also something that the new, abolition studies has been very interested in. In Palestine, it's something that I've been thinking about a lot lately. The Israelis use the power of arresting Palestinians as a key part of their arsenal, as you mentioned in the introduction. The numbers are astounding. Damir, who you mentioned, the Prisoner Support and Human Rights Association, along with the Palestinian Prisoners Club, have changing numbers. The numbers that you quoted earlier are actually constantly changing because this is a tool that is constantly at play. It literally changes daily. And in particular, this is something that I want to highlight for the audience. Under the cover of the pandemic, not as much news is being shown about. So it's also the cover of this supposed annexation and all of the debauchery that is happening with these so-called peace plans. I mean, how can you be at peace when you were never at war? But anyway, the Israeli military has been invading and arresting dozens, nearly nightly in the West Bank. So these numbers, again, are constantly changing. But how do we understand abolition within and the Palestinian context? And how does that translate into other contexts, both not just academically or in scholarly context, but also politically? It's something that I've thought about, and I'm not sure that we necessarily have an answer to, but it's something that's really exciting to think about in ways of drawing these connections with regards to our politics and not only how we think about the present and past and the future.
Thank you both so much. Those were such insightful answers. And I think it gives a lot to think about how we can apply not just formulaic, but actually very particular ways of analyzing these different contexts, but also drawing on those very important similarities. So thank you so much. And I just want to shift it a bit to a different dimension of control, which is that of looking at the border. So Rana, if you can actually start us off with this, what are some of the ways that the militarization of policing impacts border control, which I think, as you and I know, maybe some other people here around the West Bank and other parts of that region can be quite interesting, and other practices towards migrants and asylum seekers at home in both the UK and Israel. And then Adam, if you can follow up after her. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. And as a Palestinian, you understand the question is very loaded, right? So as I mentioned earlier, border police, what is called border police, is another form of military violence. And we see this under occupation in the West Bank, and it's omnipresent on the borders. So let's try to be specific. Israel as a state has yet to formally announce its own settler borders, right? But try to travel here and you very much feel and see everything that is called a militarized border. They're heavily militarized, heavily policed, heavily guarded. Who is allowed through the borders, and what those of us who manage to get through endure in order to get through become epic stories all of us have to tell. But that is what it is. It is a military settler state. And as such, settler power manifests itself in violence in all of these different ways. So all of you must be aware of the principle of the right to return. That is the Palestinian Awda. But I want to remind everybody about that right now, because we are 3 generations on since 1948 and working on the 4th generation. And it is about collective return to Palestine, which means not only crossing these heavily militarized borders, which some of us can do and most of us can't, and those of us who manage to do it, as again, we encounter and have baggage and scars of these epic stories of being able to pass through these borders. But it's about moving beyond that idea. And our work is about moving beyond the violent reality of borders as they function in this broken system of nation states. So Israel is actually, it is not an exception in that concept. It is just much more material. We are more aware of it. It's so much more, they're more audacious about it in that way, because they're unapologetic about it. Anybody who's tried to cross the bridge, which is ironically called the Dignity Bridge, which is specifically policed in order to dehumanize and strip any Palestinian of their dignity in order to enter Palestine, be it a Palestinian identity holder or those of us who do not have actual colonial identity cards and try to pass here otherwise. I also want to mention something with regards to settler policing here, is that borders are not only nation state borders, there are internal borders as well. And you're seeing this, Adam mentioned this with the use of checkpoints and the militarization and the racialization of the British police. So it's important for us to actually not only think about state borders, but about how the lack of mobility and the lack of freedom of movement is something that is part and parcel of settler militarization. And we're seeing that actually being transported to other parts of the world. So in Palestine, we literally cannot move from one location to another. There are over 500 military checkpoints in the West Bank right now. They're anecdotally called checkpoints, but what they are roadblocks. What they are actual borders. And you're seeing actually over the course of the last decade is that with the building of the annexation wall, it's basically imprisonment. So borders as prison, and you certainly see that in Gaza. And wherever there are openings, if one can call that, they've become like borders. So when you go from Ramallah to Jerusalem, if you can actually make that trip, you have to go through something called the Colonial checkpoint. And that Colonial checkpoint is as big as a border and is as policed as any other nation state border. And the last thing that I just want to say is this kind of somebody once told me that they didn't, this is certainly after 9/11 in the US, is they didn't necessarily see the kind of militarization that was happening in the US until they traveled here. And then when they left here, it was less invisible to them. So this is where you're seeing Israeli tactics actually being used being exported and being used in different locations under this guise of a war on terror, or under the auspices of a hatred of racialized minorities. Those are Israeli tactics. They're colonial tactics, but we're seeing them manifest all over the world right now. And that's my.
Thank you, Rana. Adam, if you'd like to pick up.
Definitely. So I think it's important to understand the militarization or the policing of Britain's borders, in a way that isn't totally separate from the policing of racialized communities in Britain who are documented, who have British passports or other documentation, which means that their life in Britain isn't criminalized, because there's a huge overlap between these different types of racist policing. And I think there are probably 3 different, so maybe I'll begin with thinking about the racist ideas, and then, as before, then move on to the kind of practical policing tactics. So I would say there's 3 what we might call racial folk devils, or 3 or 4 maybe racial folk devils, which are currently popular in the British imagination for justifying the kinds of racist policing which I'm going to talk about in a little bit. I would say one of them is the gangster, the idea that there are these black people with knives and guns marauding across the streets, engaging in violent crime that Britain's never seen before these black people arrived in Britain. The second I would say is the terrorist, identified as the Muslim. And of course, this is the idea that these Muslim populations want to again bring Britain into a moral decline, back to the Dark Ages. And the third, I would say, is the migrants. The idea that there are always these hordes of people on Britain's borders attempting to strip Britain not only of its identity by diluting it with its liberal and poisonous multiculturalism, but also, of course, stripping Britain of its resources, of its public services, of its jobs, and all of these other types of things. And there are three ways, and I think there are a number of ways, therefore, in which these three folk devils are policed in ways that are actually very, very similar. The first is the fact that policing of these kinds of folk devils has expanded from not just the kind of border patrols or police officers that you might be familiar with, but to other areas of public or social life. So the idea that schools and hospitals and workplaces and landlords and employers should also have legal duties upon them to identify potential gangsters or terrorists or migrants. Or so-called illegals. So now there are, so the idea that doctors and other healthcare professionals should look for signs of suspected gang membership or terrorist influences or people not being documented is now part of the kind of legal apparatus or the legal obligations that the government is trying to impose on our healthcare sector. Schools are being implicated in this as well, and where teachers are being told to identify signs of political radicalisation for Muslim students, or signs of gang affiliation for Black students, or signs of not being documented for any students of colour that they might come across. We also see it being used for landlords, where they're supposed to identify people who they suspect of not being documented and could potentially be sanctioned by the police if they provide a home for someone who doesn't have documentation. So we see this expansion of policing and borders in very, very racialized ways, going way beyond the uniformed agents that we might be familiar with and might more easily recognize as being the enforcers of this kind of border and police power. The other thing we see, of course, is the militarization of the policing of these three folk devils: the gangster, the terrorist, and the migrants. Whether it be the proposition to use the navy and other military forces across the British Channel and other parts of Britain's borders in an attempt to in a apparent or purported attempts to dispel people's hope in trying to come to Britain and as a supposed deterrent against migration here to the British mainland. But of course, we also see this militarization in the policing of so-called terrorists or gangsters, whether it be the proliferation of armed officers such as Operation Trident, which killed Mark Duggan in 2011 and led to the civil unrest which took place in the summer of that year, or of course the kind of military tactics that are being used in by the counter-terror police, who killed people like John Charles Menezes in Stockwell Police Station in South London, where the officers involved in that particular operation were also being trained by officers, by army officers who had been involved in operations in Northern Ireland and elsewhere too. And I guess the third thing that we see in a very of the policing of these three folk devils, the gangster, the terrorist, and the migrants, are the forms of surveillance that have been expanded in order to attempt to control them. Whether it be the gangs database, where people are put onto the gangs database because a family friend or a family member or a friend or a colleague or someone who goes to their school or someone who lives in their local community has been convicted of an offence, and the police have decided they're all in the same gang together because they've identified them as being connected on social media or a YouTube video, or whether it be the prevent agenda, which is criminalising Muslim students, particularly in their educational spaces and their places of worship, where they're put onto databases and surveilled, whether it be online or in their social, educational or workplaces. And again, we see this kind of surveillance being used against suspected migrants as well. And we see the NGO sector being co-opted into identifying suspected undocumented people, whether it be people who work with people who are precariously homed or homeless, or whether it be people who work in domestic violence services or many other services that oppressed people often have to access in order to survive, again being used as a way to surveil and capture data on these suspected criminal people, where racism is a fundamental way in identifying who is the criminal and who isn't the criminal. And so while we have to understand the border as being fundamental to the way in which colonial policing influences policing in a manner which is racist in its ideas and colonial in its practice, I think we cannot separate it from the other forms of racialized policing, which are more explicitly targeted towards people with documented status who aren't necessarily attempting to cross or navigate Britain's borders.
Thanks both so much for your answers. They were incredibly, I think, helpful in understanding the ways in which that policing takes on many forms and many aesthetics. And I think right now, speaking particularly on two threads that you both kind of mentioned about the war on terror and post 9/11, and kind of based on your answers, it seems that the border in of itself can become re-aestheticized or reformatted to then be brought to us. So it's no longer even about needing to move in and out of a certain space, rather that space has become kind of shrinking in on itself. So if Adam, you can please start us off with this question. How has policing of the war on terror impacted people who focus on Palestinian rights and advocacy? Can you tell us about the shrinking space to discuss Palestine and the UK prevent strategy for those who may be unfamiliar with these topics? So again, Adam, if you can start us off, and then Rana can pick up on this. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So the prevent strategy is short for preventing extremism. And I guess there are two sides to it, both equally as sinister as the other. The one side is the idea that we should identify signs of radicalism, particularly among Muslims or perceived Muslims. So these signs of radicalism, I won't go through them all, but they can be anything from people who are critical of British foreign policy, people who are particularly observant of the Muslim religion, people who seem to be particularly isolated socially, people who are suffering from mental health problems, people who are going through a period of transition in their lives, particularly if they're maybe a teenager entering adulthood. All of these different types of things which are so broad and elastic, they could be pretty much used to criminalize any young Muslim for which the agent of the state wishes to impose upon. And so one example that I'm familiar with myself, because I was at university at the time, was the case of two people who were came to be known as the Nottingham Two, Hisham Yezo and Rizwan Sabir, who were identified first by the university and then by the police as being as showing signs of radicalisation. What in fact happened was Rizwan Sabir was a politics student and was doing a module called Terrorism Studies, being run by a lecturer who was actually a former army officer himself, white Christian, so no suspicions there, and so was looking through his reading list and asked his friend Hisham, who was working as an administrator at the university, to print off one of the things listed on that reading list. And as Hisham printed off one of the things on that reading list, some of his colleagues noticed that he was printing off something related to terrorism, and then called the police immediately. And both Hisham and Rizwan had their homes raided by the police, Hisham had his office raided by the police, and we see the ways in which these young people were criminalized through this prevent strategy by identifying Muslim people as being suspects, as being people who need to be monitored very, very closely. And rather than doing an investigation or even asking a question about the printing that is being done or the literature that's being read, violence was the immediate response. Violence was the only response for this in this particular situation. And there are many, many more situations like that. And now I only know about this one in detail because it's something that, because I was studying in the politics department at this particular time. I was doing my undergraduate degree at Nottingham University. And so through the kinds of work that people are doing, particularly in relation to Palestine, we again see the prevent agenda being used, because one of the key signs of the prevent agenda are people who are critical of British foreign policy. And so when we are engaged in, for instance, whether it be public lectures or talks or workshops where we invite speakers to come in and talk about the Palestinian struggle, or if we're engaged in political protest or direct action where we engage in occupations to challenge the investment in Israeli companies that many universities are engaged in, such as Nottingham University. We see the prevent agenda being used to identify Muslim students in particular as being so-called extremists, as being harbouring intentions which are tantamount to terrorism. And so we see the prevent agenda not simply being used to repress the kind of the general academic freedom of universities generally, and the academic freedom of Muslim students in particular, but also very much something which is being mobilized to try to repress the solidarity actions and even just solidarity discussions and talks like the ones that we're having today with the Palestinian struggle as well. And it's something which universities all over the country are pushing against. And if people want to learn more, they can look up Preventing Prevent, which is a campaign being led by universities across Britain, where academics and students are challenging the way in which this government policy is being used against Muslim students in particular, but against academic freedom and political articulation across universities more generally.
Thanks so much, Adam, for that. Rana, if you'd like to pick up. You're on mute. There you go.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
Am I muting myself or are you doing it to me?
I'm not doing anything.
It's prevent. I just thank you. I just learned a lot from Adam, actually. And I think I just want to pick up on two of the things that he said, which is, the criminalization of Muslim bodies, Black and brown bodies. And again, it's this idea of just we embody something wrong. Therefore, it has to be surveilled and it has to be controlled. And that's colonialism, right? And that's, it's what is called counter-insurgency in colonialism. And what is counter-insurgency but to prevent people from resisting your the state's oppressive rule? So given what I've just learned from Adam, as far as I understand prevent, and again, this is something that I learned from you guys who are on the ground, and especially important that Adam presented, gave us the opportunity to think about prevent. As I understand it, it's over the course of the last 2 decades that, that is this presumed guilt of Black and brown bodies under the rhetoric of being preventative. It relies on deep and vast surveillance, is connected to this so-called war on terror, is connected to counterterrorism, is connected to the racialization and then criminalization of Muslims. And over the last 2 decades, we've seen this kind of hatred of an entire people, or people who could somewhat be considered close to that kind of people, because that is what racialization is of Muslims, as a shared policy between the US and Britain. And it's never more obvious than it is now, is this era of openly celebrated fascism and white supremacy. But if you notice, I'm using the same language here that I was using when I described police and policing in Palestine in the Mandate era. And I don't think that's a coincidence. Again, these are threads that are tied, and these are histories that are ongoing. I'd like to speak to the kind of silencing of spaces of talking about Palestine, or the shrinking spaces as you describe them. And that also is a form of colonial legacy. Again, those of you who are there can certainly speak to this far more than I can, but the way that I've seen this happen over the last particularly over the last several years in the UK, and then subsequently in the US, is this kind of erasure of the significant and real difference between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. Or the criticism of the state of Israel. And this kind of erasure of the difference between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism is not only dangerous, is not only politically disingenuous, but it harkens back to the foundations of Zionism as an ideology and a movement, and the core claims of the settler state of Israel, from Balfour to Johnson, in the ways that their shared ideologies, although they're changing geopolitical frames of them, Anti-Semitism is a real and historical phenomenon that is both bloody and dangerous and has its own historical roots within a European context of which Britain is a part. Anti-Zionism, or the criticism of the state of Israel, is about being critical of an oppressive state, oppressive settler state. They are not one and the same. To conflate them or make them into one and the same is actually that kind of disingenuous politics. And you've seen the result of that kind of politics within Britain over the last 3 years, and you're seeing it in other spaces and talking about Palestine. In a different kind of policing. It's a policing of being able to talk about Palestine in an academic, in a scholarly, and in a political context, in terms of justice, in terms of rights, and in terms of an anti-colonial agenda. If you equate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, that prevents and erases the spaces where we can talk about oppression and settler colonialism in Palestine. That is a particular political move that is part of British foreign policy as well as US foreign policy. And unfortunately, it's also a part of the dictatorial and tyrannical regimes that we're now seeing make supposed peace with the Israeli state.
Thank you so much for both of your answers. I'm the one who's asking the questions. But actually, your final point, Rana, points to actually the next thing that I was actually wanting to ask you about, which was delving into the nature of modern military and security support between the UK and Israel and other human rights abusing authoritarian states, particularly in light of the normalization between Israel and the Gulf states as of this last few weeks. If Rana, you can start us off, then Adam can pick up.
I'm going to actually turn this question on its head. I'll try to speak to what you were asking about, but I think what I want to think about right now is the exciting space that you and other people like you are creating, and how fully formed and constantly forming Palestinian solidarity, which is, a troubling word to some extent, but how spaces where Palestine is talked about are actually coveted spaces that you fight for and maintain. This forum this evening is a testament to this, in spite of the foreign policy that you're talking about, or perhaps because of it. This is one space of many that I know about. I know that this is a strange way to answer a question about UK complicity in the support of Israel before it was founded and until today, from 1917 when Balfour made his ominous declaration, into lending the largest and most powerful imperial power at the time official support of the Zionist movement, which was the basis of what we're experiencing today. Because of the long and deep shadow of the U.S., I think a lot of times people forget British complicity, and it's important to talk about that. It's important to talk about how the British were not only the formative part of an imperial agenda in Palestine and in the Arab world. This imperial agenda continues till today, but I know that Adam will have more to say about this. I just kind of want to talk about how the UK is also the home of Apartheid Week in UK campuses, Apartheid off campuses, the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, Friends of Beirut, and so many more, that I've learned that activist political work within the UK and how things operate locally there is an organic connection of what Fanon called the doomed or the wretched of the earth. And I think it's really important to make those kinds of connections as opposed to just the top connections, is that there are real and genuine and organic connections between what's going on in the streets of cities and towns in the UK and in Palestine and other parts of the world. One of the things that I'd like to point to is BDS, which Adam alluded to earlier, which is the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions campaign. It's a political strategy that's had incredible traction in the UK, perhaps more so than any other place. It's present in my mind today because we're seeing another tyrannical regime normalize relations with the settler state. That normalization is happening in the belly of the imperial beast in the U.S., but we know that the British support both of these certainly of the regimes in the Arab Gulf, and British support of Israel are actually formative and foundational parts of the kind of geopolitics that we're seeing. I also want to highlight the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, and one of their actions is stop funding Israel, and how that stop arming Israel, and how that campaign is actually twofold. It fits into everything that we're talking about now in this era of disaster late modern capitalism. One aspect, and I'm only speaking to what I've learned from the campaign from afar, is targeting the UK government, who sells and buys. It's important to understand that that's a two-way street from Israel. The UK is also deeply complicit in these other regimes, in particular in the Arab Gulf. And I want to highlight the UK's complicity with the Saudi state in its weapons trade, which is a core part of the geopolitics of the Arab Gulf, and is a core part of what's happening right now from the UAE to Bahrain, to what might be down the road with regards to normalization, official normalization between the Saudis and the Israelis, and how that campaign also targets, because it's smart and it's twofold, it's also targeting capitalism, it's also targeting corporate complicity by calling on HSBC to cut ties with companies that are trading weapons and technology with Israel. That campaign is actually what highlights, in a form of resistance, is what highlights the answer to your question.
Thank you so much, Rana. Adam?
Yeah, I mean, I remember recently reading an article that kind of quoted David Cameron as one part of the headline, which said the British police are the envy of the world. But what he really means by that is that the British police continue to be the model for which other nations across the world are expected to base their own police forces on. But rather than it being the self-perception of the police, who's the kind British Bobby who only has his notebook and his baton to give someone a clip round the ear for scrumping apples, or and then he rides home on his bicycle at night, what we instead see is a global circulation of police and military consultancy, of which Britain plays a fundamental role in exporting the kinds of counter-insurgency police tactics which were used during the colonial period for regimes across the planet in Britain's former colonies and other parts of the formerly colonised world to repress its domestic populations. So whether it be training troops in parts of East Africa, or building prisons in Jamaica, or providing assistance and weaponry for regimes such as Saudi Arabia and Bahrain and others that have already been mentioned, we can see the ways in which Britain is still deeply implicated in a form of what we might call neo-colonialism in the contemporary period. And while we can have to understand neo-colonialism as something which is in many ways overt in its kind of militarism, whether it be the occupations of Afghanistan, Iraq, and etc., we also need to see the ways in which British power feeds into the kinds of domestic militarized forms of policing which enable regimes in other parts of Africa, Asia, Latin America, and elsewhere to maintain power over its populations. And this is fundamentally important, not only for Britain's kind of hard power, so it's power around the world, it's the kind of power politics that enable it to have to continue having diplomatic relations with countries all over the world because its leaders more or less in its pockets, but it's also fundamentally important economically as well. So Britain still has huge investments in many parts of Africa and Asia and other parts of its former colonies, right? So it owns huge amounts of land across the African continent, for instance, huge investments in timber, in mining, in the ownership of land itself in many parts of the African continent, and being able to export police tactics and training, militarized forms of tactics and training to the governments of these African countries is what enables the British economic policies to continue to profit enormously from the neo-colonial situation, which enables Britain to remain one of the top 10 most wealthy countries in the world. So while we have to understand Britain as still being implicated in the kind of very violent and repressive regimes in many parts of the world, which aren't maybe as easy to identify as the kind of more stark contrast that we see on the manufactured borders of across Palestine, it's important for us to see the ways in which these are still deeply implicated in very, very complex and perhaps slightly more hidden ways in the reproduction of colonial norms and power structures in many parts of the world as well.
Thank you both so much for those answers. Now we're going to quickly open up the floor to some questions from our audience. And just as a premise, we would love to get to all of your questions, but due to the time and number of attendees, we might not be able to. So sincere apologies in advance. I'm going to look at our first question. This person asks, can you speak a bit more on the prison industrial complexes in both regions? And then there's a follow-up comment to that by another attendee that says, if possible, please could Adam discuss the privatization of UK prisons, if at all relatable? So Adam, you're more than welcome to start us off, and then Rana, please pick up. Thank you.
So what I would say is that isn't necessarily a prison industrial complex in the United Kingdom, in as far as there isn't the same kind of economic necessity for a prison system in Britain as there is in the United States. But saying that, there is still a huge problem with what we might call something moving towards mass incarceration. So in the last 30 years in Britain, the prison population has almost doubled. The prison population of women has more than doubled during that period. We're seeing a huge expansion in our prisons. British prisons are now about 1/4 racialised minorities, despite the fact that they only make up less than 10% of the general population. And black people are incarcerated in Britain at the same rate as African Americans are incarcerated in the United States. So we see a huge problem. And an ever-continuing problem of prison expansion in Britain. And it's the policing of so-called gangsters and terrorists and migrants, which is fundamental to that expansion of prisons. In fact, to the point in which we now have in Britain specific prisons for so-called foreign nationals. And so, which is effectively a form of racialized divide in Britain's prisons, where if you don't have a British passport, if you are undocumented and you're convicted of an offence, you are put in a different prison. So these prisons for foreign nationals are different to so-called immigration detention centres, which are effectively another form of prison, another form of racialised prison. So you have different tiers of prisons in Britain for which race and nationalism are fundamental to the ways in which different incarcerated people are categorised. I think the other thing that's important about the British prison, the expansion of the British prison system, is that we are seeing an attempt to privatise them even more. But it's not with the same gusto as we might see in the United States and other parts of the world. And so I think we should be cautious in what often can be a kind of very US-centric literature around the prison industrial complex, which focuses on the economic necessity of the prison, but instead still identify the fact that our prisons in Britain are expanding massively. Racism is fundamental to not only justifying the expansion of those prisons, but also in the way in which people are incarcerated. And I would also say that therefore we should understand the reason that prisons are expanding in Britain isn't simply because they're profitable, even though some of them are, but also because they are a fundamental disciplinary force in Britain. If you have rising unemployment, particularly racialised minorities are included in those unemployed populations, you're seeing people more likely to go into criminalised forms of employment, whether it be selling drugs or sex work or other forms of survival, effectively. And so what the prison does is it not only forms it's not only a disciplinary force for the people who are not able to access employment, but it's always a looming threat for those who are in the lowest paid jobs, who are in the lowest sections of the economy, who are more likely to enter the pool of unemployed people. It serves as a threat to those people as well. I think understanding the prison as a disciplinary force, particularly as the economy is liberalised and we see more privatisation, which makes employment even more precarious or unattainable for many people. And as of course we see the global economy going into a recession, even worse than 2008, which is what's currently looming. Partly due to the current pandemic. I think we should understand the prison as this disciplinary force for populations of people that capitalism just doesn't need for the meantime in order to exploit, and therefore it can use that system of power and control in order to make sure that those people are disciplined as much as possible.
Thank you so much. Rana, would you like for me to repeat the question?
No, I think I can sort of dovetail and piggyback on what Adam was saying.
Okay.
highlight again, sort of thinking about this out loud as a challenge. In the context of what Adam was saying with regards to sort of not imposing a different kind of sort of imperialism, is imposing the American context on the rest of the world. And there are specificities within the American context, obviously, that are translatable in some ways, but also in some ways very specific to the US context. With regard, and I see that as a challenge, right? So if we can think about this in terms of sort of translating and having a conversation that is both respective of the specificities of our context, but also thinking about how we can have a conversation. So in the Palestinian context, the challenge is involved in that, you know, you have two ways of thinking about this, obviously, like within the context of the Israeli state. And as I was saying earlier, this is a long-term legacy from colonial to settler colonial powers, the use of prisons. We saw this, you know, we see this. This is a vast literature that I was alluding to earlier with regards to sort of the British, and particularly after the mid-30s. But I actually argue that it happened in the early 30s after 1929, which was, you know, what I argue is the first national revolt in Palestine. There was resistance from the very beginning, but it was a form of sort of collective resistance. Now, in that context, so you have from the mid-30s until 1948, this whole system that the British put up, including building prisons, which are still around today. And the Israelis piggyback on that. And you mentioned since 1967, which is the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, but, you know, prisons and imprisoning people has been, again, it has a long history. After 1967, you're seeing sort of that history having a different iteration. It's connected to the legacies that came before it. But after 1967, you're also seeing within the Palestinian context a prisoners movement, which had small sort of seeds before 67, but certainly after 67, there is a vast prisoners movement. As you said, more than 1/5 of the population at this point has been imprisoned by the Israelis. Now, there's this category of political prisoners, which is well known here, and it's actually traveled throughout the world. So here, as elsewhere, there's this idea of there's a criminal imprisonment and political imprisonment. That's one of the challenges that I think we have to think about as we start to try to translate this. We've seen the kind of connections between certainly Northern Ireland and Palestine. With regards, I mean, Bobby Sands is a very well-known figure here, for example. Margaret Thatcher is a very well-hated figure here for obvious reasons, for a lot of reasons, but one of the obvious reasons with regards to how, to the connections between Ireland and certainly Northern Ireland and Palestine. So how do we translate this really active, always changing prisoners movement, which has itself over time been attacked? How do we translate this into over the borders of Palestine and across the borders of Palestine? The other point that I want to mention right now is that, and this is a very specific point to Palestine that I kind of want us all to think about. So when Oslo happened, which was a very sort of another form of Nakba in 1993, there were these things that were called final status issues. This language, this colonial language, this colonial language. The three main final status issues were Jerusalem, refugees, and prisoners. Now, you saw the U.S. officially move their embassy into Jerusalem, officially declare Jerusalem the capital of the state of Israel, as if that was going to stop that, as if that was going to create a fact on the ground. You're seeing also the defunding of UNRWA as a part of a way to deal with the refugee issue. And what you're not seeing, but which is actually happening much more so, and it's very sort of, it has great resonance on the ground here, is the prisoner movement itself has been attacked and prisoners have been attacked. And this is coming from different places. And it's a pressure that's being put onto the PA, which has no sovereignty, as we all know. It's being a pressure that's putting onto the PA. And the privatization of Israeli prisons and a privatization of the prisoners movement is also sort of another form of capital control. These are all very specific things to Palestine. How does this translate, again, across borders? How do we think about this category of political prisoners, which is it's a kind of solid category here? How do we think about trying to translate other categories of imprisonment within and translation has to happen both ways? How do we think about sort of creating these conversations, if not movements? And within perhaps what we can call the rubric of abolition and abolition studies, because as Adam was saying, that there are context specifics to geographies, but there are also threads that can connect us to other parts of the world. And prisoners is one of the main, is a very sort of alive issue, and it's constantly changing here. And this is just, I want to use this opportunity to speak about the university that I teach at, which is Butte State University. Over the course of the last 8 months, more than nearly 88, as my last count, of our students, our currently enrolled undergraduate students, were hunted down and arrested by the Israeli army in different parts of the West Bank. Our undergraduate students, kids that I teach, have been arrested. Some have been arrested under administrative detention, some have been charged, and some are still waiting for a charge. These are numbers from one university, a big university, but one university. They are targeting our students at Butte State University. So think about that for a second. A lot of the arrests, the only accusation that is being put on the head of these students who've been arrested is that they are politically active on campus. So I want to think about what that means with regards to what right to education is, with regards to academic freedom, with regards to how a university can function under occupation, and sort of highlight those issues, because those are very real issues that are constantly at play here in Palestine.
Thank you both so much for that. And I think we have time for a question from, that's the second most voted up. It's actually for Rana. This is asked by Tamara. Could Rana please give examples of specific practices used by the British on Palestinians that the Israeli state continues to use, today? And then there's a follow-up question that asks, and how do the PA fit into this?
That follow-up question is the doozy, yeah. I mentioned earlier some of the ongoing tactics. So, I don't want to get too boring. I've been told historians are boring, so I don't want to get too boring with the historical details. But if I could, just for a second, take you back into 1936. So 1936 is certainly not the only time that Palestinians were resisting, but it's very well known as the Great Revolt in Palestine. Now, this is where counterinsurgency plays a huge role, right? So the British, from the very beginning, the police were overwhelmed. The police force here was overwhelmed. So the military reoccupied. This idea of reoccupation, reinvading, happened between 1936 and 1939. And particularly, we see this happening in 37 and 38. So the kind of tactics that were going on, and again, I argue that this was happening as early as 1930, and it's certainly the tactics were happening as early as 1920, 21. Is that the British were actually creating and passing these laws, which then they were enforcing. That's what colonial logic is, right? So the laws, this is the criminalization of resistance. What they did in 1929 is they arrested, in 1929, the Barak Revolt happened. They arrested en masse, mostly Palestinian Arabs. And then they decided over the course of a year, this is the book that I was writing. And over the course of the year, they decided that they had to teach a lesson to Palestinians. This is the idea of counter. They had to teach a lesson. So they out of everybody that they had charged, they decided at the very last minute in May and June of 1930 is that they had to enforce the penal code and murder 3 Palestinians. Their names are Muhammad Jamjoom, Ata Ziyad, and Fuad al-Hijazi. They are now known as 3 martyrs. They were hung by the British. They were it's a famous song that I'm sure you know. They were led from the prison in Akka, and they were hung on June 30th, 1930. Those are famous national martyrs in Palestine. The same thing was happening over the course of the 1936-1939 revolt, where the British were using different tactics in order to be able to control and basically put down the revolt. So again, there were mass arrests that were happening. They were going into villages and under a criminal ordinance, they were demolishing homes. They were mass arresting, and they didn't necessarily need to charge the people they were arresting. So to answer Tamara's question is, take a look at Palestine right now. Take a look at right outside of Jerusalem is a village known as Silwan. They demolish 2 homes, and they actually force the people of the home to demolish their own home in Silwan. So this idea of home demolition, go to a village right outside of the university, right outside of the of Butazate where I teach. Butazate Village is a village called Kobar. 2 months ago, they demolished 2 homes of one of them was of a professor, of a colleague of mine, because her son was a suspected terrorist. So they demolished the home. They demolish homes. This is British tactics as the Israelis continue. And one does not need to go any further than looking at the numbers that you mentioned early at the very beginning of this webinar, is the number of arrests. And that is, again, a legacy of the British. I don't want to just talk about the British in that context, because the Israelis have gone above and beyond with regards to that kind of the use of that tactic with regards to imprisoning Palestinians. Now, the implicit, we can easily talk about the PA as being an implicit part of Zionist colonialism and occupation. But that's all it was meant to be. If we actually think about 1993 and the Oslo agreements, all that came out of that with the regards of creating a Palestinian Authority, all that the Israelis wanted and all that the Americans supported the Israelis in getting was a means, a structure of control and security for the state of Israel. That's all the mandate of the PA was. So to say now that that's what the PA is doing is almost disingenuous, because that's all it was meant to do. That's all the agreement brought it about to do. Now, that is certainly what it does now. Yeah, it does do that. I mean, it is part and parcel of the larger structures of settler colonial power that exist in Palestine. It's really interesting right now. And I'm not sure what'll come of it, but what's really interesting right now is we're seeing that the PA refusing to do what it was meant to do. So you're seeing that the PA, at least officially, is saying that they are no longer doing security coordinations with the Israelis, which is all they were meant to do. That is the core of its being, of the PA. Now, whether they've actually stopped doing security coordination or not is not necessarily known, but they say they've stopped. So what does it mean? What does this body mean anymore? Which is, I think it's interesting. It opens up a question of what is next politically on the horizon for Palestinians, because it's also an opportunity for us to think about how we organize again and how we have sort of reestablish our peoplehood and think about a political agenda that is about all of the people.
Thank you so much for that. And I think we're going to have one last question for Adam. Says, can Adam tell us a bit more about the war on gangs and the way Black and minority communities in the UK are racialized?
Sure. So relatively briefly, so the war on gangs in the UK probably emerged in, I guess, the mid-2000s. It was around this idea that there was a rise in violent crime. And like mugging that I mentioned before, gang crime is not a crime in itself, it's a category of crime. So like mugging, as I mentioned before, what the government and the press and the police were able to do was vacuum up lots of existing offences or crimes into this new category of crime called gang crime, and therefore creating the impression there's a new problem, there's a different problem. Right? And if there's something new and something different, it must be the people responsible must be people who are new and different. And those new and different people were young Black people across Britain. And so some of the ways in which we see Black communities policed in this way are, for instance, the use of a gangs database. So there's a big gangs database, it's called the Gangs Matrix, where the police will identify people who haven't necessarily committed an offence or even suspected of committing an offence, but have intelligence gathered on them through the monitoring of social media or simply identifying people who have been stopped and searched a number of times on suspicion of carrying marijuana or drugs or anything like that, and can be therefore put onto the gangs database. And people who have been if people are interested, they can read a report by Amnesty International called Trapped in the Matrix, where they've identified that the police have taken this gangs database and used it to stop young people from accessing college places. They've called up the college and said, that person you've given a college place to, he's on our gangs database, you shouldn't give him a place at college. They've contacted housing associations, don't house this family, they've got a gangster in that family, don't house that particular family. They've used it to convict people, to deport people as well. So if someone is convicted of committing an offence, rather than them simply receiving a custodial sentence, they will be deported at the end of their custodial sentence because the police have said that they're in a gang. In fact, the government has funded specific gang prosecutors for the police in order to identify people as being involved in a gang, and then make sure they not only receive a custodial sentence, but a longer custodial sentence. So I think the other thing it's important to mention is how clearly the racism is reproduced through the policing of gangs. So two researchers, Patrick Williams and Becky Clark, based in Manchester in the north of England, did a study a few years ago on gang members in Britain. What they realised was that both Greater Manchester Police and London's Metropolitan Police had gangs databases. So they said, right. They went to both these police forces and said, can we have your gangs databases broken down by ethnicity, please? They said, yeah, sure, here you go. They said, right, so they said, how do you define what a gang member is? Who is a gangster? And they said, it's anyone who's involved in what's called serious youth violence. This can be anything from very serious offences like discharging a firearm or attempted murder, all the way down to less serious violent offences like common assault. They said, right, can we have that broken down by ethnicity, please? Yep, sure, here you go. So what did they find? They found that the overwhelming majority of people on the gangs database were black, and the minority were white. But when it came to this group of people who were involved in serious youth violence, the majority in Manchester, the majority were white, and the minority of them, about 73% were white, and about a third of them were black. And in London, it was 50-50 between black and non-black, which is roughly proportionate with London's youth population. So what does this tell us? This tells us that the criteria that the police say they're using for identifying gang members is not the criteria they're in fact using, and that race is a far more coherent indicator as to who is or who isn't identified by the police as being a gang member. And as I mentioned, being put on this database has huge implications, not simply for being stopped, more likely to be stopped, searched, arrested, imprisoned, deported, imprisoned for a significant amount of time, but also has knock-on effects for people's likelihood to get a place at college, getting housed, getting many other parts of social life as well.
Thank you for that. And I lied. I actually have one more question, then we're ending. And it's for both of you. And this is one I'm quite partial to, so it's a bit selfish. I think, as both of you have really beautifully explained throughout this webinar, the current justice system focuses on punishment rather than prevention, or seeking to meaningfully address structural violence by the roots. So I'd like to ask you both, what can and does accountability and community well-being look like? And how does this inform a rethinking of justice in the context of UK and Palestine? I think, Rana, especially, you've mentioned this, like, what does it mean then to look at these mechanisms beyond than what their purpose now? Whoever would like to start off, if Rana, you'd like to go ahead.
Adam, go ahead.
Okay, so I would say that I think we should understand, I'm sure a lot of people who are in this webinar are really critical of war, really critical of invasions of other countries, really critical of bombing cities and towns, particularly by powerful nations, like, you know, those members of NATO and others, right? But I think what we have to do is, as I mentioned before, not understand the police and the military as two separate entities, but understand them as a continuum. So in the same way as we know that bombing and using military force against Iraq and Afghanistan hasn't made those places any safer, hasn't made those places any more peaceful, hasn't improved the livelihoods of those people, the people of those countries. We should also understand policing in a similar way. More policing of working class communities, of racialized minorities, more violent policing of those communities, more incarceration in those communities is similarly not going to bring about peace or security or prosperity for those communities. In fact, in both of those contexts, the military invasions of Iraq, Afghanistan, other parts of the world, and the policing and incarceration of oppressed communities in the domestic context actually brings more violence into those contexts, not less. So what can we have instead? Instead, we need to think about ways in which we can actually have preventative measures that can deal with the social problems that exist in oppressed and marginalized communities. We need gainful employment, meaningful employments, right? Strong trade unions particularly within oppressed and working class communities. We need decent access to healthcare, access to education, free education. well-funded, proper education. We need youth services. We need mental health services. We need women's shelters and domestic violence services. We need decent housing. We need all of these types. We need proper environmental regulations. These are all of the types of things that can help people to live in far safer environments that don't allow the state to rely on police or the military, right? Don't rely on invasion or prisons. Don't allow them to rely on bombs or incarceration, right? We have to have social solutions to social problems, and I think really importantly, they have to be community-led. We can't simply rely on the state to provide and bring the leadership for these kinds of alternative social solutions to the kind of social problems that are too often resolved or incarcerated or bombed away. And instead, we need to have those kinds of community-led social responses. And that's a vision which many activists call abolition. It's a vision of a world in which both police and prisons are no longer necessary, but also I think it has to be a vision in which the army and militarism is no longer necessary or no longer something that is part of people's everyday lives and their existences as well. And I think understanding police and the military as a continuum rather than something separate, I think is a really useful way of building those links between what's happening domestically in Britain and what's happening in Palestine.
Yeah. That was beautiful. I'm not sure I want to.
Thank you, Adam.
I want to thank you, Adam, because that was beautiful. And I think all I have to add is that you use the word justice. So I think about what does justice mean in Palestine? And I think what lies at the heart of this is what can be called decolonization. I humbly think it has to do with how we understand oppressive power and the close and deep connections, as Adam just said, between military and police in terms of their origins in Palestine in the early 1920s and how that can't be divorced from a reality in 2020. And it's the work that we've been doing today together towards imagining what a decolonial praxis is. I don't know or pretend to know what it entails in its entirety, but it's about love and care that Adam was just describing. It's about a process and political praxis that has to be worked out through our own work and what we need. It's about dismantling the power of the state. Here, the settler state, there, the police state. It's about social justice and economic equity. It's about nurturing a politics that is concerned with the collective well-being of all of us, the many, and not about the profit of the few. It's about not being denied entry at a violent border of our homeland in Palestine. And it's about never seeing another boat of people. Don't just call them migrants, drown in the Mediterranean, escaping from violence into death. It's about living in hope rather than living through fear of systemic violence against Black and brown bodies because they are Black and brown bodies. And it's not about witnessing my students abuse lose semesters, if not years of their life to prisons here. Decolonization is dismantling the structures of power that have been built up for more than a century and more than that. And I think that's what we're doing right now. And that's what Adam was just talking about. And I think that's the political praxis that we share. And that's the conversation that we can continue to share amongst each other.
Right. Well, we've reached the end of our talk today. And I want to thank you both so much, Jen and Adam, for giving us your time and sharing your knowledge with us. And I sincerely hope that our audience has learned as much as I have. I mean, I honestly could sit here for a full day, but I know that's probably not ideal for everyone involved. And I want to thank you, our audience, for joining us, for your time, engagement, and questions. If you enjoyed today's talk, there are a number of ways you can support us. For those of you who are able, we do have a donate section at the bottom of your screen. Again, if you are able to make a contribution, but you can also share our activities with your communities and join us at upcoming events. We are also on social media, so follow us at McCann Writes on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Again, thank you so much, Adam and Rana. I mean, astounding, actually. And I hope that we can carry these conversations and actions forward, not on just this platform, but in other dimensions. We've also now added you all to our mailing lists if you weren't already on there. So you'll be receiving updates on upcoming talks and events that we're hosting. And finally, just a reminder, this is recorded with English subtitles, so you will be receiving a recording of today's talk within the week or so. And thank you so much again for joining us. Hope to see you at some of our upcoming events, and I hope you all have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for having us. Take care.